No. What just happened? What is this? Minimize that? That's really, what are they doing to me? Oh, they're really pushing the AI. Yeah, they really are. Yeah, Microsoft is pushing Copilot in front of you, every which way. It's unbelievable.
I figured out what that is, yet keep putting up with
You know what Chat GPT is? Never mind.
it.
Okay, let's, where are we at? We're talking about, finally made it almost to the 20th century. We get to, yeah, we're gonna get to, about to get to World War One. A war that often gets a conflagration which often gets overlooked. But we just talked about Darwin and Marx, which I view, I think I said last week, as two sides of the same coin. Darwin introducing the very basis for nihilism, the elimination of the very possibility of meaning or purpose or design of any kind, but not order. That's where it gets interesting for Darwinists, but not order, but meaning, purpose, design from the universe gone. Any residue of the influence of an intelligent presence outside the confines of the universe was ejected from their point of view. From God's point of view, of course not, but from their point of view, was ejected, was ruled out by the rules, so to speak. It was simply by assumption, by premise, ruled out. And what we are left then is a thoroughgoing naturalism, which we talked about last week. And I read that statement that I made to another church back in 2018. But essentially the idea that physical reality is all the reality there is, matter plus energy without remainder. Nothing else requiring explanation. And so therefore, everything that exists is, at least in principle, susceptible to scientific inquiry. Inquiry can be studied. That's the premise of naturalism. It is not proven. There's no evidence for it, of course. How on earth would you prove that the only reality is physical reality when all of your tools can only study physical reality? So it's kind of this idea, which is not original to me, that you basically decide, you operate under the premise that whatever my net doesn't catch is not a fish. My net catches them all. So if my net can't catch it, then it's not a fish, which is false. Of course, there can be fishes that your net doesn't catch. In this case, the fish is the big fish, God himself, which is a bad analogy, and maybe that whole thing was a bad analogy. But anyway, that's naturalism, that's Darwinism. It's thoroughgoing, and it's going to be what's the word when you can't stop it? Unstoppable. Let's just say that. It's a force that will not be stopped in either science or education. And then on the other side of that coin, roughly the same time, 10 years earlier, is Marxism, which ironically provides a framework for purpose in human history. That human history is headed inevitably towards an end, towards a destination, which is ridiculous. Their destination is ridiculous. But that's the Marxist premise, again, not proven, it's a premise. And so that's Marxism and Darwinism, the two most influential forces, in my view, in modern life in the last since 1848, when Marx wrote Das Kapital, which is really crappy German on my part. So that's those two, Marx and Darwin, which turned into two isms when you get true believers, Marxism and Darwinism, which continue to this day. And they are dogma. Darwinism is dogma, and Marxism is dogma to a certain part of the political spectrum in the world. Okay, so that leads us to secularism. which is this also almost unstoppable impulse to eject anything, any form of religion or theology or superstition from the public sphere. That's the great secularizing force of modern, of the post-enlightenment period. And so the idea would be to get, you have to insulate the public institutions from the contamination of the pre-modern medieval religious world. And so this will go on now pretty comprehensively in Western culture. Well, from that day, from then till now. And that's,
Gary, I want to take exception to that. And that is only like Christian religion is banned, but the idea of all spiritualism is not, because things like visualization, finding your spirit guide, all of the occult type things are still allowed. In fact, they're going to become pushed for quite a while. Probably still are in media, in schools, in everything, even in churches, sadly. So it's not everything banned exactly. It's just true Christianity is banned. The idea that there's an actual creator, but not that there aren't ghosts and spirits and spirit guides and all the things that would be involved, even in like African culture, you know, with the old gods and goddess. That's not banned. Everything else is, though. But go ahead.
and so, okay. That takes us to secularism, which is this driving force to modernize institutions. And that's the definition of secularism. If you're wondering what does secularism mean, it means exactly that. Think secular is the elimination of the sacred canopy, what Peter Berger, the sociologist, called the sacred canopy, which is a great book. But that idea that we're going to lay over our world a religious canopy that makes sense of it. Well, that canopy's been removed post-enlightenment. It's gone, and it gets replaced with this thoroughgoing Darwinism. Darwin is it itself is practically a religious impulse, but gone is the religious canopy, that the narrative that told the story that made sense of the world in which we live. And now what we're supposed to use to make sense of the world in which we live is Darwin. And then this optimism, this modern optimism right here, this idea that we can continue to create a better and better world through technological improvement, innovation, creativity, and so on and so forth. And so that will now drive American culture, Western culture, and in many ways, very effectively and very successfully. But what gets left out of the picture is that sacred canopy, that religious narrative, having been replaced now by a secular narrative instead. And the problem with the secular narrative is nobody can give a good reason. It has no defense against its enemies. It has no defense against people who would subvert it. And so the secular narrative will start to encounter real problems about 2 decades ago, because it has no defenses. So we'll get back to that in a little bit. But at any rate, there was a man named G.K. Chesterton, who was a social philosopher, writer, British guy, very influential for C.S. Lewis. If you read his book, Orthodoxy, which is excellent, it's a classic, I highly recommend it. You'll go, oh, that sounds like C.S. Lewis, only it's the other way around. C.S. Lewis sounds like him. He was very influential for C.S. Lewis. And so he wrote that book, Orthodoxy, in the midst of these wars over this kind of thing, in defense of orthodoxy, that the idea that orthodoxy was a good place to be. because it gets a bad rap. It was already getting a bad rap. He wrote that book in 1908, I think, Orthodoxy. But he said this about the sect. He had a way of, like C.S. Lewis, probably not coincidentally. He had a way of capturing a thought, pointing a term, capturing a thought. He's got a million of them. You can go look for his Chesterton quotes. They're all over the place. But he said this. This is by 1908. He can already see the writing on the wall. So secularists have not wrecked divine things much as they wanted to, but the secularists have wrecked secular things, if that is any comfort to them. The Titans did not scale heaven to bring God down, but they laid waste to the world. Now he wrote that. When did he write that? I got to find out when he wrote. Did he write that post World War II or World War I? He may have. I don't know. I got to go hunt down when that was. If that was before World War I, that's one of the most prophetic statements ever uttered. If he wrote it after World War I, then it's reflective on the greatest disaster in human history up to that point. But anyway, the spirit is correct. They cannot wreck divine. The secularists, the secularizers cannot wreck religious things because they have no say in God's plan and no effect on it, except to participate in it against their will, regardless of their will. And he was onto that. He became a Catholic. He ended up being Catholic. But he was onto exactly that point, because those were the kind of debates that were happening as the secularizing force picks up steam in the late 80s. Guys like him were on it, and the effects that it was going to have on culture, which the secularists, they just weren't paying attention. They are now. We'll get back to that. But anyway, that's G.K. Chesterton. These guys, you look at these famous names, and then you go look at pictures of them, and you go, wow, it's funny looking hair. Like he's wearing a wig or something. That's all you think about is funny looking hair.
He wrote a series of mystery books too.
Did he? Yeah, I should read more Chesterton.
I think actually, C.S. Lewis, like Renee Brennan, C.S. Lewis should read stuff.
Find out.
Yeah, Ron mysteries. He died at 36. I'm not sure when C.S. Lewis was on the scene.
Let's see. One of the multiple influences that shaped Lewis' conversion to Christianity, Chesterton looms large. What was your question again?
I asked if they were like actually spoke to each other instead of just reading each other's words.
I don't know. I don't know if they ever knew each other. They overlapped. They would have overlapped some, but I don't know.
Yes.
There we go. Let's see. For the pre-conversion Lewis, the entire cosmos. Why am I getting sidetracked on this? Lewis was also a firm believer in his prose, which was instrumental in Lewis turning to the Christian faith. Thank you, Mr. Chesterton. But I don't know. Seems to imply that they met, but we don't have time to look at it at the moment. But yeah, they were certainly of the same caliber of importance in British culture. They were, Lewis was a little after Chesterton. All right. Anyway, back to the Great Event. So that takes us to the end of the 1800s. One of the other, now there's just going to be the scientism, this practically worshipful attitude. The high priest. It's not like the secularists produced a world with no priests. They just simply replaced them. Instead of it being the priestly garb, the garb of the religious priest, the Catholic priest, it's the garb of the scientist. The scientist becomes the new priest. The scientists become the new priests of the culture, and what they say, they speak with authority. They say what they say, and we saw a little bit of that during the COVID period, where scientists, there was this mystical, debate-ending statement that journalists would make about COVID. They would say the consensus of science is something about COVID. Or the science is settled. And you can practically hear the ring of the priestly decree in it, right? The priests have spoken.
Follow the science. Trust the science.
Oh, it's just, trust the science, follow sure. If you overthrow religion because, you don't want authority, you want to rebel against authority, but now that you want authority, you're supposed to just trust the science and believe all scientists, as if all scientists say the same thing. They never do.
You know,
I don't know.
Marx and Darwin had an impact on the church in that it led to theological liberalism. Trying to, merge what they're teaching with what the Bible is
Yeah.
teaching.
Marxism will make its way into the church, and it will do so. It's still doing so today, and it will infiltrate even very respected evangelical organizations.
Yeah, well, social gospel, is
Yeah.
awful Marxism.
Liberation theology
Interesting.
from South America, Pope Francis came out of that world, I think.
That
Yeah.
purple,
No, that's the one that just died.
I can't keep their names straight.
I don't know what to make of this new one. He doesn't seem to be behaving the way that many people of a certain political persuasion were hoping,
Oh, really?
up to and including the name he picked, Leo. That was a bad omen for them because of Leo's Leo the first reputation.
Oh, I have not remember.
Because it's more traditional. I'm not sure, but yeah, he picked Leo, which is really ironic because his heritage is South American.
Oh,
He's from California, but he's South American. I think he's Peruvian or something like that.
I thought it was from Chicago.
Oh,
That's where minister.
I thought it was California. No matter. Okay. All right, so that takes us to the end of the 1800s. I'll mention one event that's transformative for you, and that is that the King James Version of the Bible, which had reigned supreme in the church for 1611 to 1880, 1898. Is that right? 1898. 200 and, well, at least, well, no, since till Westcott and Hort, till about 250 years, the King James Version reigned supreme. And then manuscript work began to be done because there's a huge number of discoveries of ancient manuscripts, very, very old manuscripts. And so people began to work on new editions of the Greek text, which resulted in the overthrow of the Textus Receptus, which we talked about, Erasmus's Greek text that formed the foundation for Tyndale's work, and then the King James Version in 1611. But now there's new Greek text. There are new Greek texts being formed. Westcott and Hort, two scholars whose names, if you run up to the front of a King James only church and yell Westcott and Hort, you're gonna have to run out really fast because they're gonna be chasing you down the street. They are considered the great devils of scholarship because they create a new text, Greek text, and it will result in ultimately the overthrow of the Textus Receptus, the majority text, the Greek text underlying the King James Version. And the result of that work, you're going to go through Westcott and Hort, and then a guy named, you don't care about this too much, von Tischendorf, so I'll do this quick. Von Tischendorf is another guy. Von Tischendorf was the guy who discovered, I think, the Codex Alexandrinus, or no, Codex Sinaiticus.
Oh.
In a monastery. The monks were throwing away, they were burning old manuscripts. They were burning these papyrus scrolls, so forth. So
Wow.
von Tischendorf is going out and about looking. He's like Indiana Jones. He's looking for archaeological finds. So he's going to these monasteries and so forth. And so he sees them doing this, and he realizes what they're doing, what they're burning. And so he manages to get it stopped. And one of the things that they find is this 4th century Codex Sinaiticus. Virtually, is that the full one? It may be an entire manuscript of the New Testament in Greek. That's 1800 back to the 300s. So 1500 years earlier. And so there's all this new scholarship that's going to form. Westcott and Hort are gonna create a Greek text. I think von Tischendorf made a Greek text. And then, most importantly for your purposes, a man by the name of Eberhard Nestle. This is the most important person you've probably never heard of. Eberhard Nestle created a Greek text of the New Testament known as the Nestle. Well, at this point, it's just the Nestle text. And I think the first edition came out in 1898, if I remember right. And there has been edition after edition of that. And we are now on the 28th edition. It's now called the Nestle Aland text. Kurt Aland, German, took over from Eberhard Nestle. Actually, I think Eberhard Nestle's son, and then to Kurt Aland. Kurt and Barbara Aland. Aland, it's a husband and wife team. Guys like Kurt Metzger, who wrote a book called The Text of the New Testament. It's transmission and something, I forget what the words are, but he tells the von Tischendorf story in that book. That's also, everybody should read that book. It's a little scholarly, but it's so insightful on the manuscript tradition and how the formation of the Greek text. But anyway, so we now have a 28th edition. They're working this thing over bit by bit. And the people the committee that produces this text is really, really confident that we have here the New Testament in the original language. Meaning, this is what they wrote. And there's not a lot of debate about it, but you can't end the debate. Because if you decide that you have the original text, well, an entire world of scholarship, textual criticism, gets obsoleted. So, you got all these text scholars. If you do, well, your work is done. So you have to go find something else to do. Well, they're not going to go find something else to do. So, it's going to be, oh, no, there's this little piece of this one verse here. That's we got to write a whole piece. We had a bunch of PhD dissertations to write on that. So there's more work to be done, It's like this.
Interesting story in that, because a group of British and American scholars came together to write a new translation based on the Westcott and Hort text. And the British scholars and American scholars didn't agree with one another. So the British scholars published the revised version, the RV, and the American scholars produced the American Standard. But they had to wait for 10 years after the RV came out before they could publish the.
Are you talking about RSV? The revised standard?
RSV.
Yeah, the RSV is the translation is the translation committee's.
Well, that came.
English translation, yeah.
The RSV is the 1950s.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Before that, and this goes back up to the 1870s or 80s, because Spurgeon would refer to that text sometime.
Yeah.
And he died in 1892. And so they couldn't agree, but for some reason, because of copyright constraints, the American Standard had to wait until 1901 to be published. Whereas the other one was 78, 1888, something like that.
Yeah, I had American Standard Version at one point.
It's one of the hardest versions to read at all.
Yeah, anyway, it's exciting times.
No.
With all these manuscripts coming in, we're recreating 1800 years after the birth of Christ, almost 1800 years, 1900 years after the apostolic period. And when these books were written, we're recreating the New Testament out of the sands. It's astonishing. And here it is. And so, we can complain because why do we have all these different English versions and so forth? But what we don't have to do is debate the Greek text. That's what counts. That's the most important thing. So anyway, that's a whole summer. I could talk about that all summer. So I just wanted to mention it and move on, hopefully quick. And I did pretty good. He tried to distract me for a little bit there.
Distraction.
So that's going on in the late 1800s too. Ironically, at the same time that biblical criticism is kicking into high gear and the Bible is being pulled apart by the seams and in their minds discredited and so forth. The most important scholars for that delegitimizing, if you will, in my view, of the Bible would be a man by the name of Wellhausen in the 1800s who came up with formulated this thing called the documentary hypothesis, which picked apart the first 5 books of the Old Testament. I think it's largely been discredited. It's largely been discredited, but people still take it seriously. And then the other guy is Rudolf Bultmann, Germans, those German scholars, who wrote in the 1900s and picked apart the gospel tradition. And he has been, I think, thoroughly discredited in terms of his work, but they're still heroes.
That was the neo-Orthodox movement.
I think Bart was also a part of that. But anyway, you're trying to distract me again.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on and let's get back to the business at hand. So there's some happy news in the late 1800s. You're going to end up with a Greek text that is going to give us a very reliable English text. That doesn't all come from the same 6 or 7 manuscripts that went into the Textus Receptus. Okay, that takes us across the turn of the century there, and we reach that last dotted line, World War I. There's the world before World War I and the world after. And I was just, it can say a lot about it. Started in, there's a book called The Guns of August, which is a good intro to World War I. I forget who wrote it, but August of 1914. And it just, because of a series of alliances after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand by the Serbian assassin, all these, did I get that right? Somebody can correct me. All these treaties sound familiar. All these treaties suddenly kicked in all at once in no time at all. And the next thing you know, Europe finds itself at war over the assassination of an archduke from a formerly great empire who doesn't matter. And everybody's at war. From Germany to Russia to Britain to France, the Turks will be involved, and it just erupts. And the end result is going to be a complete transformation of everything, including the United States. The United States before this time was not a player, was a bit player. It will exit World War I in a much higher stature, and then it will exit World War II in a position of supremacy, including basically overthrowing the British Empire. But I was, I think I listed out, I was listing through, yeah, here's the legacy of World War I. I think you're all used to thinking World War II, right? That was the great disaster of the 20th century. So the immediate dead, 10 million. The genocide of the Armenians by the Turks, 1 to 1.5 million. The use of widespread use of chemical weapons, mustard gas and chlorine gas. Spanish flu, the spread of the Spanish flu was a direct result of the front line. 500 million were infected. That's 1/3 of the world's population at the time. 50 million were killed. For those who think that COVID deserved to even be discussed in the same sentence as the Spanish flu, which also can't be discussed within the same sentence as the Black Plague. That's the scope of this. Even though those numbers are high, in terms of percentages, it's a different thing. Stalinist Russia, we'll just move forward. So there was a Bolshevik coup in the Soviet Union, in Tsarist Russia, the Leninists, the Bolsheviks successfully executed a coup, which gave them power. They call it a revolution, it's a coup, which put Lenin in power, which will change forever the world. And the result of that will eventually be Joseph Stalin, who replaces him. And then the 30s, 40s, and 50s, you have to add up the dead, and you're going to get somewhere between 40 and 60 million. It depends on who you talk to. Hitler's Nazi Germany was a direct consequence of World War I, partly because Hitler's seething resentment toward the Jews was inflamed by what happened in World War I. He had this idea of this mythical, diabolical presence of international Jewish finance, which he blamed on everything. The really crappy settlement that the Germans got from the Allies, and which was true, with the reparations that were owed by Germany, he resented that. And so the rearmament and the resurgence of Germany in the 30s was a direct result, and the rise of the Nazi Party was a direct result, remembering that they won by vote in the 1933. when he became chancellor. But anyway, all of that was a direct offshoot of, that's the child, the offspring of World War I. Hitler's Nazi Germany. So you can lay that at the foot of World War I as well. Mao Zedong's China, communist takeover of China. The Chinese nationalists end up on Taiwan, and now we have that country, that little country over there, mainland China's communist. 50s and 60s, these are such well-kept secrets. It's amazing how effectively these numbers have gone under the radar, but you're talking about another 60 million. That's not a particularly flamboyant number. If you want to say 40 million, fine. But that's the 50s, 60s, and 70s, relatively recently. Pol Pot's Cambodia in the 70s, the Khmer Rouge, if you've ever heard of them. 1.5 to 2 million, a third of the population or more, he killed of his own people. He lived into the 2000s. I think there's interviews with him. Never repented any of it. Just amazing. And then, of course, the repartitioning in the Middle East and Europe. And so you end up with a country like, artificial country like Czechoslovakia with all these ethnic groups that hate each other. And then by the early 90s, you have the Bosnian War, where they're just genociding each other because they never should have been thrown into the same country. Kuwait is an artificial country. If you look at Kuwait, it's a little carve out of Iraq. So the Iraqis never thought of Kuwait as a legitimate country, which would explain why Saddam Hussein acted the way that he did. But you know, there's all of these things. The Palestinian, the partition, the British mandate in Palestine, what is called Palestine, you know, what ended up being a Jewish state. That mess there, that was all done after World War I, after World War II, World War I and II, which will eventually result in a Jewish state in 1948, declaration of a Jewish state. All of that, plus other things I probably forgot about. I just checked some numbers, but these are the ones that came off the top of my head. All of that is the offspring of World War I. It's unbelievable. And so you come out the other side of World War II, and the world is just weary to no end, right? I don't know how much more we even want to talk about that. We want to get to this period right here after this dotted line. But I give the birth of transnational globalism, transnational, you know, like Trans-America, you know, transnational, what's the word? Transcending national borders. That becomes the big movement. And what's going to go with that movement is an ideology and a morality. That nationhood almost becomes morally suspect in favor of this globalizing. You had this secularizing force. Now you have this globalizing force. And for those of you who remember in the 90s, globalization was the big buzzword. Everything was about globalization, international trade. You had in North America, you had the what? What was it called in the 1990s? NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. You had the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's all these things happening all over the world. You have BRICS, British, Russia, India, China, South Africa, these coalitions forming, breaking down these trade barriers. And so they call it free trade. It certainly is not free trade, but it's all part of this transnational globalization that's happening. It's I would replace the word transnational with anti-national. We'll get back to that too. So let's just revisit our words up here a little bit. In modernity, let's say before World War I, when you could still be optimistic about these things, you know, you have the improvement of society through the efficient running and creation and running of public institutions and the removal of religion. You have technological advancement, diseases being conquered, you know, so on and so forth. That spirit will continue to kind of hold on, you know, even into the 60s, 70s, and 80s. You know, in the movies, oftentimes film is reflective of this. So you have, for example, even in the 60s, if you watch these films from the 50s and 60s, there's this optimism about science and what science can do. And then there's also this suspicion, this suspicion about it as well. You have to, the limits of human knowledge and so forth. And if you watch these old movies, you'll see this play out all the time. But you have, for example, just to use a really obvious one, what's the statement from the theme song of, what does James T. Kirk say in the original Star Trek episode during the opening song? Huh?
Trying to think, been a while.
It's
Something about beyond.
to boldly go where no man has gone before. And you're gonna go out and you're gonna build this great new world. You're gonna spread, we've conquered all of our little petty differences and our propensity for violence, and we're gonna go out and spread this gospel, of progress. Would be the buzzword of the modern period. You're gonna spread that to the other planets, and you're gonna form, you're gonna bring them into the, what is it called? What's the alliance? I forget the name of the alliance, but they're gonna invite him in, and so on and so forth. And so that's the spirit, that's that modern spirit of optimism. What else do we have? Individual liberty, individualism as an ism, and liberty, individual liberty, an emphasis on empirical evidence. And so, you don't assume anything is true. And then, of course, naturalism. But
It's interesting because they can't empirically prove Darwinism.
no, it's a historical science. It's a historical science. Darwinism is historic. It's not a hard science like physics. It's a historical science, like anthropology. And as soon as you make one extra discovery, it completely flips up your narrative. And actually, they're going through this in physics right now, as they seem to be having second thoughts because of the James Webb Telescope. They're having second thoughts about the Big Bang. I don't really know the nuances of it, but I don't care all that much. But I mean, it's interesting. But anyway, that's modern optimism and progress through science, technology, and the continual improvement of public institutions. Then there's World War I, which shatters the faith in modernity to its core. Because what did this technology get? Our institutions didn't save us. On the contrary, they were the downfall, because these treaties were there as a matter, as elements of public institutions. It's not like the religious people did this. This is the public institutions that are doing that had these treaties. And by about 1916, nobody could even figure out why they were at war. These people are dying. Everybody, there's millions dying. The Germans are on one side of the demilitarized zone. That's not what it's called. I forget what it's called. The Allies are on the other. Is the famous story of the Christmas meeting? I forget which Christmas it is. When the Germans are over there and the Allies are here, and they have a little meeting, like a Christmas party thing in the middle. And while there's the stalemate going on from the bunkers, they all come out and they do this, and then they go back. So that happens, and you're going, why do I want to kill those people? They don't want to be here either. It's just like, so this goes on for a couple more years. I don't remember when that was. We need Randy, my friend Randy, who's an expert at all this stuff, lives in Virginia. But you drag yourself up again off the ground, and in 1918, but now you have a whole new set of problems coming because of Stalinist Russia and so forth. And Germany rearms. Actually, everybody's excited about it. Germany's back on its feet. Germany's getting confidence again, and so on and so forth. Well, okay, not so fast. 1939, they attack Poland. They go into Austria in 38, but they attack Poland, wipe that country off the face of the earth. Russia helps itself, and then it's on. And then after the war, we find out, some people would say long before that, but after the war, it comes out, 6 million Jews have been exterminated, plus unknown number of other people. It's just laid waste. Germany is laid waste. France is laid waste. Great Britain survived, but it is no longer an empire. The United States has taken supremacy, so that the pound, their currency goes down, the dollar goes up, the dollar becomes the currency. And we come out of this World War II, this conflagration in World War II, and we're in a new nuclear age where instability, how do you build a better world? All of the technology and institutions that you were counting on to produce the better world, look, you overthrew, you can't blame religion. Nah, right? This ain't a religious war. You guys talk about 1618 to 1648, a religious war. We're never going to have that happen again. No, you're right. You're going to outdo that by an order of magnitude because you're going to produce the weapons that you need to kill an order of magnitude more people. That's what you're going to do. Name the weapons. So we come out of that period with atomic weapons, then nuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs. New enemies get created, Stalinist Russia, communist China, and now we have this polarized world where there's this standoff. And on the Western side, it's all about transnational, anti-national globalism. And so out of that is going to come, for example, the European Union, eventually, where Europe is going to give it a try. We're going to erase the borders. We're going to remove the borders and produce one big happy European family. Not so fast. 2015 with the migrant crisis, which continues to this day and produce nothing but instability. So the more that it's supposed to promise stability and progress, it produces instability. And so this is what happens coming out of World War II. There is an optimistic spirit. The 50s is a pretty good decade. The United States is supreme. NATO is now fully engaged, and it's, you have the NATO on one side and Warsaw Pact on the other. And we got this standoff going on, this Cold War. And the Western countries, Germany's rebuilding, Japan is rebuilding. It's going very, very well. And it's going to result in this alliance, this Western alliance that the Japanese will be involved in too, and eventually South Korea. But that's the situation coming out of World War II. It's this anti-national backlash because they blame the nations, which they created at the Treaty of Westphalia, I'm thinking out loud here, at the conclusion of the 1618 to 1648 war that produced these nations. So now they somehow want to undo it. I'm still thinking out loud if I'm right. I don't know, I need a historian. They want to undo that to some extent and have a European Union with a single currency and so forth. So that drive begins after World War II. The big player in that regard is the UN, United Nations, which I'm not sure it's ever prevented a single war or even slowed one down, possibly. And so that takes us to the 60s, where things are going to change dramatically, because what's going to happen now is the children of these people that came before them, the silent generation and World War II generation, the children of them, the boomers. I was in the second half of the boomer class, so to speak. I was born in 62. There's going to be this event called the Vietnam War. And this is a war specifically dedicated to the conflict, the standoff between Western, I don't know what you want to call it, Western culture, the Western pole, let's just call it the Western pole, and the Soviet pole, the Western bloc and the Eastern bloc. And so in the 60s, we now have this war that is a direct consequence of that in Vietnam, and it does not go well. Every single mistake in the book is made, and we have a draft. And so you're drafting these kids into this losing war from their perspective. And, it just leads to social instability. And so these movements began to kick in as a consequence to that. they're all kind of connected. It's not an accident that the civil rights movement happened at the same time as the anti-war movement, happened at the same time as the women's liberation movement, happened at the same time as this love affair with drugs. All these things happened at the same time as the Beatles. All of these things happened at the same time. And so what's going to come out of the 60s then is, again, culturally an entirely different world. And so it's almost as if the period between World War II, the end of World War II, and about 1972, when it's all over in Vietnam for the United States, 74, officially in fall of Saigon, it's like a transition period. And now what comes out of, I'm still thinking out loud, none of this is written down. I hope I'm right. What comes out of that is just a different world morally. The world that came out of World War II morally was roughly like the world of the 1800s morally, even though it was secular and they had thrown off religion. But there was no question about truth or morality, those types of things. People still believed in absolutes. But what's going to come out in the 60s, there's going to enter this relativization, this subjectivist relativist impulse, privatizing impulse that's going to come out of the 60s. And that's going to change everything. And so what we're going to do, we can introduce it right now. There's a lot of ways. This is now the world in the 1960s where cultural Marxism begins to make itself felt. And this thing called the Long March Through the Institutions, where the American left decides that it wants to subvert bourgeois values, the bourgeois values that these institutions have been operating under, that have got us into things like the Vietnam War. That's how they see it. There's these kernels of truth there, but it's this classic case of throwing a baby out with the bathwater. But that begins what has been called, if you've ever heard the phrase, the Long March Through the Institutions, by people you've never heard of, like Marcuse, who've had more influence on you than you could ever imagine. We're only going to look at the feminists because at the end of the day, in my view, the world of today is ruled by feminism. Feminism has won, and we're going to look at that. But what came out of the 60s was this coalition of it's sort of a moral sense about the way things ought to work. I'm really stumbling around now, but none of it is Christian, and none of it holds the Western idea of the family at the top of the thing. This is about individual liberation and social justice and those kinds of things. So morality, doing what's right, that's all going to get replaced with the spirit of the times. It's going to get replaced by this idea of social justice. And that's now going to pick up steam. And so you're going to see these waves. Let's see. We're going to see these waves of feminism that are going to begin to wash across the decades very, very quickly. I forgot to mention one. And we'll close with that since we already talked about it. And then we'll talk about second wave feminism, which is the feminism of the 60s. Most of these names you should have heard of. And you'll notice I got a weird one down there at the bottom. Yeah. We're going to talk about her. And J.K. Rowling. Funny things are happening. Weird things are happening in the women's movement by people who don't necessarily want to be involved in it. Like Martin Luther didn't want to be involved in any kind of overthrow of a German church. But in first wave feminism, the fight was over women's suffrage, the vote. And so that fight was won, which also transformed the country, because you had segment voting that never voted before. They vote different from the way that men vote. So we can talk about that as well. But then post-Vietnam, or in the midst of Vietnam, a second wave of feminism hits with names like Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique, Gloria Steinem, these kinds of people. And this is all about sexual liberation and female empowerment. And that sexual liberation will change morality. You now have a change to sexual morality, which changes all of morality, which will result in things like 1973's Roe v. Wade ruling and so forth. And it just, one after another, they just topple. So we'll talk about the effect of this because we're heading towards a time now, we can talk about Black Lives Matter as well. And what on earth this has to do with Christianity and the current state of things and the modern church, because it has a lot to do with it. This is now the culture war. This is now the culture war. So we'll pick up there next time. When I go back and listen to this one, I may find that I stumbled all over the place. This is tough to talk about unless you diagram the whole thing out and really research it, which I'm kind of talking off the cuff. So anyway, thanks for joining. See you next week.